The Bible is the greatest work of literary genius, and I want to show you how. Let's start with genius. And to do this, let's think about 3 works of extraordinary genius. The first one is Caravaggio's painting Narcissus. Now, you've probably seen this before. It's about the myth Narcissus, the Greek myth, and it's about this man who's so self-obsessed and self-absorbed that one day he catches a glimpse of himself in the reflection in a pool of water, and he's so enamored by himself that he ends up dying staring at himself, being so narcissistic. And that's Caravaggio's painting. Okay, pretty simple, right? The second one is Plato's Republic, arguably one of the greatest pieces of philosophical work ever written. And I want to read to you just the first line of the Republic. It starts like this. Plato says, "I went down to the Piraeus." That's it. Now, it's pretty straightforward. It's setting the scene, so we get the location. They're going down. It's actually Plato and Socrates, and they're going down where? To the Piraeus, which is this port town where a lot of people are. And so the author, Plato, is just establishing the main characters, the setting, and the first action of the plot. They're going down to the Piraeus. Pretty straightforward. And the third work of genius is the Bible, Matthew's Gospel. And the text I want to look at is in the 2nd chapter of Matthew's Gospel. And what's happening is Jesus is born, but then it becomes too dangerous for him to stay in Israel. So based on a word from an angel, he's sent down into Egypt. And then when it's safe, he returns to Egypt. And then after that happens, Matthew quotes from an Old Testament text, and this is what it says. "This was to fulfill what was spoken through the prophet, 'Out of Egypt I have called my son.'" Now, what's going on is pretty straightforward. Jesus has this geographical movement that is similar to another one of God's sons in the Old Testament. This time it was the nation of Israel who's first called God's son. And he, just like Israel in the Exodus, they go down into Egypt and then come back out. Matthew is making a parallel between these two, saying, hey, they both have this geographical movement. They go down into Egypt and then come back out. Pretty simple. It's pretty easy to understand. Now, here's the weird thing. Who's the first person you think of when you hear the word genius? Albert Einstein, right? Or what do you think about if you had a piece of genius, a work of genius sitting in front of you, a page with words or numbers on it? What do you think about? Well, I think most people think about complicated language or complicated equations. But the interesting thing is when you actually look at those works like we have that are generally accepted as works of genius, they're pretty simple and pretty comprehensible even to a child. So genius is not about complicated language or numbers or something like that. Think about this thought experiment with me. Let's say you have a scientist, and this scientist has made a great discovery and he writes a paper about it and he sends it off to get published, and his editor says, wow, this is an amazing work of genius that you've created here. Just one thing. Can you rewrite it and rewrite it in a way that a 10-year-old could understand? Well, what would the scientist say? He'd probably say something like, haven't you read it? I mean, there's just no way I could do that. It's impossible. It's too hard. Notice what happened. It was not too hard for the genius to discover his great insight, but it was too difficult for him to simply communicate it to a child. Genius is the ability to communicate simple truths and profound truths at the same time. It's the ability to communicate to both the pedestrian and the PhD with the same language. Let me show you how. Now, the simple truth contained in Caravaggio's painting is pretty simple. It's a painting about the story of Narcissus. But what else is going on? At the deeper level, for the PhD, what's going on? Well, notice a few things. First, notice the main shape of the pose. What does it look like? Well, it's circular, kind of like an oval, kind of like an eye. And notice something else. Do you see what the main color is? The most saturated, largest blotch of color. What is it? It's his knee, and it's green, and it's inside that oval. What's the point? Well, both his pose and this color is meant to connote, to symbolize an eye, the color in the iris and the shape of the eye. What Caravaggio has done, what genius this is that the central, the essence, the organ of vice is pictured here in the whole architecture of the image, the main compositional shape. It's wonderful. And there's more that's going on. Look at how he has bisected the image. He's chopped it up in two halves, the top part, which is Narcissus, and then the reflection. And at first glance, you may think, oh yeah, it's just the reflection. But if you look closer at the reflection, you see a couple fascinating things. Look at his face. What has happened to it? It's become dark and ugly and dead. And look at that big blotch of color. Where did it go? It's gone. You see, what Caravaggio is doing is he is showing the effect of his narcissism. His reflection is what will happen to him, and what will happen is he will become less lively, more dead. And one other thing, notice his hand, his left hand. Do you see where it is? It's just entering into the water. Well, what's Caravaggio doing? Well, he's communicating that Narcissus has already started to enter into that death of the reflection. Isn't that genius? I love it. Plato started out giving us the three main elements of any story, that is, plot, character, and action. But he's doing something else too. Do you remember the story of the allegory of the cave? You probably read it in high school. And it's this story about the world and what the world is like and what the world is like for a philosopher. And what happens is you've got this cave, which is an image of the whole world. You've got all these people who are chained to the wall, and the only thing they can see are shadows on the wall moving back and forth, and they mistake those shadows for reality. And this is the image for Plato and for Socrates of the world. That's how most people are moving around, that their picture, image, sight, world view of the world is one of shadows and not reality. And the philosopher comes down into that world, into the cave from above, from where he's contemplating the good. Well, notice how Plato starts. It's just this subtle, beautiful move he does. I went down to the Piraeus. Do you see what he's doing? He's already characterizing Socrates. He's actually already characterizing his whole great work. What is this work, the Republic? The Republic is Socrates going down into the cave. The book is going down and will educate and enlighten us as to the reality of the world. It's this intimation right from the first act action down to the Piraeus to where the people are. It's amazing. Now, third and most beautiful, Matthew. Now, on first glance, it's pretty clear what's going on. You have this parallel movement. Israel goes down into Egypt and comes out, and so does Jesus. But if you try to put together the pieces of the parallel, something fascinating comes about. Because this does double duty, telling us, characterizing not just Jesus, but someone else as well. So put together this parallel in your head. So in the Old Testament, you had Pharaoh, and he murdered the children. He was told the midwives to kill all of the firstborn sons. And in the New Testament, you have Herod, who's doing the same thing. He's killing the children. But Pharaoh was the king of Egypt, and Herod was the king of Israel. He is saying that Israel has become Egypt. Do you see that? The rulers of each nation are doing the same thing, and so this is primarily a characterization of Israel in the time of Jesus, and they have become so dark and evil and murderous that they are doing the same thing as the paradigmatic enemy in the Old Testament. That is genius. This channel is going to be about the literary genius, the literary art of the Bible. And we're going to do that by walking through the first masterpiece